My grandmother's lawyer called, I was elbow deep in a sink full of dishes, still wearing the same hoodie I'd slept in. I almost didn't pick up. I almost let it go to voicemail like I did with most unknown numbers, because nothing good had ever come from a call I wasn't expecting. But something made me dry my hands. Something made me answer. "Miss Calloway," the voice said, "your grandmother passed this morning. She left instructions that you be notified first." I sat down on the kitchen floor right there, between the cabinet and the trash can, and I didn't get up for a long time. My grandmother was the kind of woman who kept fresh flowers on the table, even when money was tight, who remembered how you took your coffee from one visit to the next, who could make a house feel like home just by being in it. She raised me from the time I was 6 years old, after my mother, her daughter, decided that the open road and a man she'd known for 3 weeks were more interesting than a first grader who still needed someone to check under the bed at night. My mother left on a Tuesday. I remember because we'd had pancakes that morning, and she'd let me pour my own syrup, and I thought that meant it was going to be a good day. It wasn't. My grandmother never said a bad word about my mother. Not once. That was its own kind of lesson. How a person could hold their grief and their anger and their disappointment and still choose not to poison the child in front of them with it. She just quietly became everything my mother wasn't. She drove me to school. She sat in the folding chairs at every single school play. She learned how to braid hair from a library book, because I'd come home crying once that all the other girls had braids and I didn't know how to ask for what I wanted. She learned it from a library book. That's who she was. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped waiting for my mother to come back. By 16, I'd stopped thinking about her much at all. By 22, when my grandmother's small landscaping business had grown into something real, 3 crews, a greenhouse, contracts with 2 local municipalities, I was working beside her every summer, learning how to read a soil report and negotiate a commercial bid and write a proposal that didn't sound like it was written by someone who'd learned everything from YouTube. She wasn't grooming me consciously, I don't think. She just wanted company, but what she gave me was an education no classroom could have delivered. And then she was gone. The service was small. My grandmother had outlived most of her friends, and she'd never been one for fuss. A few neighbors, the pastor from her church, the woman who'd run the front desk at her accountant's office for 15 years and apparently had developed a genuine fondness for her over tax season. I wore the blue dress my grandmother had told me once looked like the good kind of sad, which I'd never fully understood until I was standing at her graveside in it, and the sky was exactly the same color. I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. 3 weeks after the funeral, I got a certified letter. The return address was a law firm in Phoenix, which is where my mother had apparently been living for the past several years, a fact I had not been made aware of and had not asked about. The letter informed me that my mother, acting as the sole surviving adult child of my grandmother, was contesting the will. She was claiming that the business, the property, and the liquid assets, a total somewhere just under $400,000, which represented 30 years of my grandmother's work and careful saving, rightfully belonged to her. Her argument, according to the letter, was that I had exercised undue influence over my grandmother in her final years, that I had manipulated an elderly woman with declining cognitive capacity into rewriting her estate plan to exclude her own daughter, that I had, in effect, stolen what was hers. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it on the kitchen table and I made myself a cup of tea because that's what my grandmother would have done, and I tried to think clearly. I had not spoken to my mother in 11 years. She had not attended my grandmother's funeral. She had not, as far as I could document, made any contact with my grandmother in at least the last 7 years. No phone records, no cards, no visits. My grandmother had rewritten her will. Not in secret, not in crisis, but with her regular attorney, in good health, 4 years before she died. At the same time, she'd updated her business succession plan and renewed her commercial insurance. It had been a routine Tuesday. Her attorney had described it as such. None of that seemed to matter to my mother's legal team. I found my own lawyer through a referral from my grandmother's accountant, a woman named Helen who had, in fact, genuinely liked my grandmother enough to attend the funeral and who had also, it turned out, kept meticulous records. My lawyer was a man in his early 60s named Mr. Sir Baxter. who wore the same two blazers on rotation and had a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being quietly filed away for later use. He was not flashy. He was not dramatic. When I explained the situation, he wrote several things down, asked me for a timeline, and then said, "Do you have documentation of your role in the business over the past several years?" I did. I had contracts with my name on them, I had emails, I had payroll records, I had photographs from job sites, timestamp. I had a letter my grandmother had written to her banker 3 years ago recommending me as someone authorized to act on behalf of the business, which contained a paragraph about my contributions that made me cry when I read it again in Mr. Baxter's office. "Good," he said and clicked his pen. "We'll be fine." I wanted to believe him. I did not entirely believe him. The months between receiving that letter and walking into a courthouse were some of the longest of my life. I kept the business running. I paid the crews. I showed up at job sites and answered emails and went to bid meetings and did everything my grandmother had taught me to do, because the alternative, letting it all fall apart while lawyers argued about whether I deserved it, felt like a betrayal I couldn't live with. Some nights I sat in her greenhouse, the one she built from reclaimed windows and a kit she'd ordered from a catalogue in 1987, and I just breathed. Tomatoes, basil, the particular green smell of something alive and growing. She'd loved that greenhouse more than almost anything. I thought about what she would say. I thought she would probably tell me to water the seedlings and stop catastrophizing. So I did. The morning of the hearing, I drove myself. I didn't want anyone to come with me. Not because I was trying to be brave, but because I didn't want to spend the drive managing someone else's anxiety on top of my own. I wore a blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion, grey, the kind of thing my grandmother would have approved of, practical, serious, not trying too hard. I walked into the courthouse carrying a folder of documents that Mr. Baxter had organized by category, rubber-banded by date, color-coded with those little adhesive tabs that come in the school supply aisle. It was not lost on me that my grandmother used the same system for her invoicing. She was already dead. I hadn't seen my mother in over a decade, and the strange thing was that she looked both exactly the same and completely different, the way places from your childhood look when you go back. The scale is off. Something about the proportions doesn't match your memory. She was sitting at a table with two men in suits, and she was wearing a silk blouse, and her hair was the same dark brown it had always been, though that was probably not natural anymore. She didn't look at me when I came in. I sat down at my table and folded my hands and waited. Her lawyer went first. He was polished, the kind of polish that takes money to maintain, and he talked about my grandmother's age and her increased dependency on me in her later years, and the word isolation came up more than once, the implication being that I had cut my grandmother off from her real family, that I had inserted myself as a gatekeeper, that the generous, clear-eyed woman who had raised me had somehow been gradually diminished into someone manipulable without anyone noticing. He made it sound plausible. That was the frightening part. He was good at his job, and what he was describing, stripped of all context, stripped of all 27 years of history, could almost sound like a story about something real. My mother nodded at the appropriate moments. She did not look at me. When Mr. Baxter stood up, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He just started with the date, the Tuesday in October, 4 years before my grandmother died, when she sat in her attorney's office in full possession of her faculties, declined the offer of a notary-verified cognitive assessment, and then agreed to one anyway because, as the attorney's notes reflected, she wanted the record to be absolutely clear. He read from those notes. He read from the updated will and the addendum my grandmother had written herself, by hand, explaining her reasoning, not because she was required to, but because she'd wanted to. She'd anticipated, it seemed, that this day might come. She knew, I heard myself think. She knew and she planned for it anyway, and she just never told me because she didn't want me to worry. That almost broke me. Sitting in that courtroom with my hands folded and my color-coded folder, I came closer to falling apart in that moment than at any point in the preceding months, because that was so entirely her, protecting me quietly, handling things so I wouldn't have to. I held it together. Then came the part I hadn't fully anticipated. The judge, an older man, maybe late 60s, with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had been listening to people argue for a very long time, had been quiet through most of the morning. He'd asked a few procedural questions. He'd looked through the submitted documents with the focused attention of someone who actually reads what is put in front of him, which I'd been told was not a universal trait on the bench. But when my mother's lawyer finished his closing argument, the judge set down his pen. He looked at the documentation in front of him. He looked at the notes from my grandmother's estate attorney, and then he looked up. "I'd like to ask the respondent a question directly if there's no objection," he said. Mr. Baxter said there was no objection. The judge looked at me. "You've been running this business since your grandmother's health began to decline." "Yes, sir. Actively since about 4 years ago, though I worked alongside her for years before that." "And during the period the plaintiff describes as one of isolation, the last 4 years of your grandmother's life, do you have documentation of her independent activity, contacts outside the home, outside the business?" I did. We'd submitted her church attendance records, which her congregation had kept diligently. Her book club correspondence, she'd been in the same book club for 19 years. A letter from a doctor, who had seen her regularly and noted no cognitive decline of clinical significance until the final 4 months of her life. A photograph of her at a municipal planning meeting, sitting in the front row 18 months before she died, raising her hand to ask a question about stormwater drainage affecting the greenhouse district. That was the one I liked best. That was the one that looked most like her. The judge looked at these for a long time. Then he said, "How long has the plaintiff been estranged from her mother?" The silence that followed had a particular texture to it. My mother's lawyer said something about a complicated family situation and periods of distance that are common in many families. The judge waited for him to finish. "The record indicates," the judge said, "that there is no documented contact between the plaintiff and the deceased in the 7 years preceding death. No visits, no correspondence, no phone records." He paused. "And yet the claim is that the respondent exercised undue influence to exclude the plaintiff from an inheritance. Undue influence requires a relationship of dependency and a pattern of manipulation. What I see in the submitted documentation is a granddaughter who showed up, who worked, who was present, over many years, during which time the plaintiff was not. The deceased was not isolated from her family. She was, it appears, simply abandoned by one part of it." My mother's lawyer started to respond. The judge held up one hand not unkindly, and the lawyer stopped. "I've reviewed the will, the accompanying handwritten statement, the legal attestations, and the evidence of the testator's cognitive status. I find no basis for the claim of undue influence. The will stands." I don't remember exactly what happened in the minutes immediately after. I remember Mr. Baxter putting his hand briefly on my shoulder. I remember the sound of my mother's chair scraping back. I remember looking at the window on the far side of the room, the light coming through it, the particular flat white light of a February morning in a building that was built before anyone thought about making courthouses feel welcoming. She didn't speak to me. I don't know what I would have said if she had. Outside, Mr. Baxter shook my hand and told me I'd handled myself well. I thanked him and meant it. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I drove anywhere, just listening to the ventilation system hum. That was 8 months ago. The business is still running. We picked up a new contract this spring, a residential development on the east side of the county, the biggest single job we've ever had. I hired a full-time project manager, a woman in her 40s who used to run a crew for a larger company and wanted something where she had more autonomy. My grandmother would have liked her. She shows up early and argues productively and keeps a running list of things that need to be fixed before they become problems. She reminds me a little of the person I'm trying to become. I go to the greenhouse most mornings before the workday starts. I've kept it exactly as it was, down to the tomato varietals and the slightly crooked shelf on the south wall that my grandmother never got around to straightening. Some things I'm not ready to change. Maybe I won't ever be, and maybe that's okay too. There's a handwritten note taped to the inside of the greenhouse door, the one she left with her attorney along with the will. He gave it to me afterward, in a sealed envelope with my name on it. She'd written it 4 years ago. The same Tuesday she'd updated everything, and it says what you'd expect, that she loved me, that she was proud of me, that she wanted the business to keep growing in a direction she could be proud of. But the last line is the one I keep coming back to. You never needed anyone to give you a chance, sweetheart. You just needed someone to stay. I'm glad I got to be that person. I think about that a lot. About what it means to stay. About the people who do and the people who don't, and how, somewhere in the difference between those two choices, a whole life gets shaped. She stayed. She showed up in the small, unglamorous daily ways that don't make for dramatic stories but make for real ones. And then she made sure, even from wherever she'd gone, that no one could take what she'd built for me. I don't think I'll hear from my mother again. I don't know what I'll do if I do. Some questions I've decided I'm allowed to leave open, at least for now, living in the space where I don't have to have an answer yet. What I know is this: I'll be at the greenhouse tomorrow morning. I'll check the basil. I'll look at the crooked shelf and leave it exactly where it is, and I'll carry her forward in the only way she ever wanted. Not by grieving her, but by growing. I keep coming back to a simple fact. My grandmother made her choice every single day for over 20 years, and nobody forced her to. That's what I want people to understand when they hear this story. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one big moment of sacrifice. It was Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons and a library book about braiding hair and a seat in every folding chair at every school event that didn't have my mother's name on it. Cause and effect works slowly, most of the time. What you do consistently, who you show up for, who you stay with, that's what accumulates into something real. My mother made her choices too, and those choices had a shape to them by the time we ended up in that courtroom. Not because the universe was punishing her, but because decisions compound. Absence compounds, presence compounds, and one day you look up and there's the result. What my grandmother had that I'm still learning to build in myself is something I can only describe as moral clarity, knowing what you owe to other people and actually paying it, quietly, without waiting for recognition. She never held what she did for me over my head. She never made me feel like a burden she'd graciously agreed to carry. She just did the right thing because it was the right thing, and she trusted that living that way would be enough. It was. It was more than enough. The court documents reflected it. Her attorney's notes reflected it. The photograph of her at a planning meeting, 18 months before she died, hand raised to ask a question about stormwater drainage, that reflected it too. You cannot fake a life like that. The record of it exists whether anyone is watching or not. The part that took me longest to understand was the intelligence underneath her steadiness. She didn't just work hard, she planned. She thought 4 years ahead and sat in her attorney's office on a routine Tuesday and made sure that a handwritten statement would be waiting for me in a sealed envelope when I needed it most. She saw what might come, as she prepared for it without telling me, because she didn't want the preparation to become a shadow over the time we had left. That kind of thinking, quiet, forward-looking, clear-eyed, is something I'm trying to carry into how I run the business now, to see what's coming, to document what's real, to not leave the people I care about without a record of the truth. And then there's the part that was just mine to do. The months between getting that certified letter and walking into the courthouse, I had to keep going. Pay the crews, show up at job sites, answer emails, not because I was certain I'd win, but because falling apart would have meant giving up something she'd worked 30 years to build, and I couldn't do that to her memory. I've thought about that a lot since, how endurance isn't really about being strong in some abstract sense. It's about having something worth staying standing for. She gave me that. The greenhouse, the business, the crooked shelf I still haven't straightened. Reasons to keep going that were bigger than my fear. I don't know what my mother is doing now. I've made peace with not knowing. What I know is that I'll be at the greenhouse tomorrow, and the basil needs checking, and there is work to do that she taught me how to do. That's enough. That will always be enough.